Hey everyone, welcome to the Awakening Report. I have a special guest on. We're going to talk about some ancient technology that seems to be talking about maybe quantum physics. Could it be fallen angels, ancient aliens? I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. But I am excited to bring on Johanan Raatz. He is going to talk about some amazing discoveries that he has made. So, Johanan, thank you for being on the show, and I appreciate you bringing these very timely and pretty fresh discoveries. So, kind of tell us what you discovered.
Well, I didn't I discovered the physics half of it, but the connection with the esotericism stuff was. This was just showed up a couple of years ago. I was having this kind of depressive funk, and some of my fans were posting this link to this book in my Facebook group, Idealism and Science versus Atheism, was being passed around among multiple friends actually, and I just kind of like pushed it off because I was dealing with other things then. However, I got around to seeing it, and it turns out that actually another friend of mine, Kyle Allender, started making a series on him because he's another quantum idealist guy, and he started making a series on this, and so I looked into it. And anyway, what it turns out is that there is an occult science which supposedly comes from ancient Egypt called Hermeticism, and apparently this occult science has, according to this book, and they present some pretty interesting evidence which I'll lay out. I'm gonna be kind of careful to like draw conclusions about this because the conclusion is pretty far out, but they raise some very interesting parallels between modern physics and Hermeticism. And I find this, I'm like, at first I was this is crazy, but then I look at them like, this is actually interesting. Not to say that it's true, but that there were parallels to talk about that got me curious, as it were. It was like one of those, like say you're watching some mystery show on the paranormal or whatnot, and 99% of the time or 90% of the time it's baloney, but every like 10% of the time you bring up some little details that like kind of stick out, and you're like, whoa, what is that? Right. Well, this whole book is whoa, what is that?
Wow. Well, yeah. Take us deeper. I'm really curious to hear.
All right, so it's called the Quantum Hermetica. It's from 2018, published by Olivia and Ethan Palmer. And basically what there was this text on Hermeticism released by the Masonic Lodge of Chicago in 1908 called the Kybalion, okay? And they go through 7 principles of Hermeticism in like a chapter on each, as well as some other chapters on related topics. And it turns out that, according to this book, and they do a pretty good job documenting each step along the way, like the entire book is documenting parallels. By the way, this is on Amazon if anyone's interested. I'm sure Doug can provide a link when we're done here. They all have direct parallels to physics, very advanced physics, and some of the physics was not, actually all of the physics essentially, was not yet discovered at the time when the Kybalion was written. And so in some cases they had to wait, for example, the chapter on vibration, we'll get to this maybe a little bit, was very clearly talking about wave functions or probability waves, okay? And that wasn't yet discovered for another 18 years in 1926 when they discovered the Schrödinger equation. And they also describe something that sounds uncannily similar to quantum entanglement, as well as, believe it or not, much more advanced stuff, such as stuff that you could basically get from emergent space-time physics. And then there was,
so wait, so the ancient Egyptians were kind of onto this stuff? I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, it was strange. Yeah. The thing with it is, I mean, you think about the ancient Egyptians, they were very advanced, and they actually talk about this in the book. At the last chapter, they talk about, there's this enigma of, you see this very sort of out of place artifact, right? They're describing, I mean, granted, this is the Mason saying that it came from the ancient Egyptians, and the problem is the Kybalion was written pseudonymously. There are some people who have some ideas as to who wrote it, but no one really knows for certain. But they're claiming it comes.
This is going to, of course, raise a lot of questions for people, because this is a source that many would consider to be absolutely, untrustworthy. So
That is correct.
why would we give any credence to this?
The issue is not that, by itself, you would want to say, okay, well, why trust the Freemasons? I mean, that isn't some kind of creepy cabal that's trying to, take over the world with the deep state or something like that, right? Well, that may be true, but the thing with it is that there are these parallels between this text and the modern physics. And that by itself raises eyebrows. It's like, well, okay, maybe they were not telling the truth, or maybe they had these weird mystical ideas or whatnot, and therefore they're, you can't trust that. But the point is that what was being described in this text turns out to also describe in very precise detail physics that we're just discovering right now.
Okay. Wow.
And so now you're starting to wonder, well, wait a minute, where did they get this from?
Right.
Because this is, it's independent corroboration. You might want to trust them, but you can trust the physics because that's, independently verified. And that in turn is corroborating, there is this objective parallel that is existing, whether or not the original source is trustworthy. And that by itself it raises eyebrows and makes one curious as to what's going on.
Right. And so when is this Masonic book, when was it written?
1908.
1908. Wow, that is just at the cusp there of some of the quantum physics discoveries.
Well, actually, that's the thing. The very, very early stuff, but the quantum physics discoveries that, the ones they describe, and there's some that are more advanced, like when they talk about the principle of mentalism, it's basically idealism, but they're describing it, you can describe that in a physics language, and I've done that completely independently on my channel, and it seems that after the authors might have actually picked it up from me in some respects because it's some of the same kind of. They're talking about Hoffman's conscious realism and space-time emerging from integrated information theory, which it all gotten pretty popular by the time this book came out. A couple years before that. Wow. But yeah, there were some things here like they talk about the principle of vibration, which is the third Hermetic principle. Mm-hmm. They get to, let me find where that was. It's in, I think, chapter 5 of the book. The Quantum Hermetica book, that is, not the Kabbalion. I forget what is in the Kabbalion. But anyway, okay, so let me read this paragraph just to give you a clue.
Go for it.
What is interesting to note about the cases given in this chapter is the fact that the teachings on vibration include direct parallels with physics discovered only after the fact. Remember, this is in 1908 that it was first written. This includes the general discovery of quantum mechanics and its associated quantum vibrations with the Schrödinger equation, 1926, the non-local nature of those vibrations in 1935, the zero vibratory rate of the universal wave function in 1967, the discovery of space-time as a network of entanglement with which matter is also unified, that's 2004 and 2015, and the mental nature of those vibrations in 2015, that's quantum cognition. The Kabbalion, by contrast, was written decades, and in some cases a full century before in 1908. So, isn't that strange?
Yes.
Like they knew this. This is, some of this is literally cutting edge physics. The discovery of space-time emerging from quantum entanglement. It directly comes out. This was actually officially verified last year. Like they called the DS mirror. They had a pretty good hunch that it was the case from the ER equals EPR correspondence and the ADS mirror correspondence. Last year, they came out with something called the DS mirror correspondence and showed that space-time actually emerges. Our space-time, not just de Sitter space, or ADS, is space is very close to our space, but de Sitter space is our space, our kind of space-time. And they showed that de Sitter space emerges from quantum entanglement.
So kind of unpack that for people, because a lot of people don't know what you're referring to.
Quantum entanglement is this idea is basically when you have two particles that share the same wave function. A wave function is a quantum probability wave, which if anyone's out there is familiar with the double slit experiment, they have this situation where you shoot a single electron through a pair of slits, or this apparatus with a pair of slits with a screen in the back, and you shoot one through at a time, and it will start to form an interference pattern, despite the fact that it has nothing to interfere with.
Right.
And it's probabilistic, and what the conclusion was, and they've done many experiments after this to kind of confirm this is what's going on, is that the particle is actually in multiple places at once, distributed in a probability wave. It's not in one location in space, it's in multiple places in space.
Right.
And that's called a quantum probability wave. Now, as it turns out, you can put two or more particles into the same quantum probability wave at the same time. And when you do that, they're called quantum entangled. And so when you have two particles and you separate them that are entangled, and you separate them at a vast distance, and you observe one, and that fixes the state of one. And instantaneously, the wave function collapses for that same quantum state, thousands of miles away or thousands of light years away, right then. And then the other particle will take on the exact opposite property, or the complementary property of the first particle that was collapsed. So there's this instantaneous correlation that, is there's nothing connecting the two. There's no signal being passed between them. Mm-hmm. They're not like just being, pre-correlated or anything. There's just this instantaneous connection that's not going through space or time.
Right. And this is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance,
correct.
Right? That he wrote in the EPR paper, right?
In 1935. That's why this came out in 1935.
And that's what's so amazing is that he was trying to disprove some of the conclusions
this
of
would
quantum
be,
physics.
if this existed in reality, it would be ridiculous. Right. It would be ridiculous, but it's real anyway. And now we have technology based on it. They use
Einstein, EPR, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen were actually incorrect, even though they found this amazing thing suggesting this couldn't be, but that in reality, that's what actually was, right?
Yeah, and not only that, but now they've discovered with quantum gravity that space-time itself at a very deep level is an illusion. And it's not just an illusion, but the thing that undergirds that illusion is quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement, there are quantum computations occurring in quantum entanglement, and quantum entanglement is not actually operating in space-time, because if it was, it would violate relativity. But it's going underneath space-time in some sense. And what turns out is that what we call space-time, physical space-time, is actually a construction that emerges in quantum entanglement. Wow. So not only is the spooky action at distance exists, but it's actually the fundamental thing, and the thing that we think of as normal, the space-time we think is normal, that has, that's actually a construction from within this bizarre, spooky entanglement thing.
No, I just love this stuff. I mean, when you start comparing it with Genesis, that everything came out of the mind of God, right? That's what that's what Planck was saying, and many others are saying. It's all a mental construction, right? We can't ignore this anymore. It's such amazing stuff.
And that's the thing. Hermeticism talks a lot about it being a mental construction.
Okay.
And it has, but it's interesting because it ties in the physics angle to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't tie. Well, it doesn't call it physics. It just says this is the way it is. But then after the fact, this book comes along. I find this book that Cal Allender is making videos on, and I look at this and I'm like, whoa, this is these are actually parallels with modern physics.
Wow. I love this stuff. It is so mind-blowing. So both Niels Bohr, Max Planck, Einstein, they're all talking about how really there is no matter as such, right? Just everything is small little vibrations of energy, right? And that begs the question, where did this energy come from? I mean, my answer would be it all comes from God. Right. So we definitely have God on this side, but we also have, there's a whole host of malevolent beings who have decided to rebel against God. And they did some things that weren't so kosher.
It's interesting you bring this up because it's interesting because the book itself says not to do this. Like, it actually has a warning in the book itself. Don't play with this stuff.
Okay.
But there are certain, this was actually kind of spooky. They talk about the use of the pentagram in here, and apparently this has a connection to physics as well, something called causal dynamical triangulations. And it turns out, when you're doing middle school geometry, right, you're asked to construct a space, right? You start with a point for a single, point, right? Zero dimensional space. To make a one-dimensional space, you need a second point, you draw a line, right? And you draw a plane with these 3 points and so on and so forth, right? Well, a causal dynamical triangulation is trying to triangulate space-time, okay?
Well, okay.
And so it needs 4 points, or actually, you need 5 points because you have, 3 for 2 dimensions and so on. You need 5 points, and I don't know what the reason is for it, but apparently it produces a, to get a space-time, to triangulate a space-time, you need a 4-dimensional object called a pentachoron, okay? It's a tetrahedron in 4 dimensions.
Okay.
And for whatever reason, this tetrahedron, this pentachoron has to be projected down into 2 dimensions. I think it may have something to do with holography. I'm not certain of the exact details of the physics, but it is mentioned in the book.
Okay.
And And they have citations on all of this. So if you're saying like, well, this could be a quack book, I mean, I was thinking that at first too, because I mean, the subject is kind of quacky. It's not. I mean, it sounds kind of quacky, but the actual it really did their homework. They've got like 7 pages worth of citations on this, and it's all hard physics.
Wow.
Yeah, and so basically, it produces this 2-dimensional projection of this. And when you do that, well, what do you get? You project this 2-dimensional pentagon into 2 dimensions. What happens? You get a pentagram. And it turns out that in causal dynamical triangulations, this is how space-time emerges. And not only that, but the contents of space-time emerge. And so you're causing stuff from the quantum information underneath space-time, which in a different, in kind of a more classical way of thinking about it, you could think of that as a supernatural realm, right? It's, classically thought of the natural world as those things which exist in space-time, right?
Okay.
I mean, they're not treating it as such. They're treating it all as a science, a very elaborate science. But, traditionally you think, well, everything, not knowing any better, you think, well, everything in space-time is, if you didn't know, live in the Matrix or whatnot, or in an emergent space-time universe, everything inside space-time is physical reality. Everything outside of space-time, because everyone associates the physical with the material. If it's not in space-time, it's not material, which then people think, well, that makes it supernatural. In a certain sense, yes, but in a different sense, well, no, there's a physics to that as well.
Do you think, sometimes I think that we're all on the same, basic continuum, right? You have like, when we talk about light, we talk about a electromagnetic spectrum, right? And there's some things that we can actually see and some things we can't. I kind of get the feeling that going from the spiritual realm until to ours, we're all sort of on the same continuum. It's just that there's some things that we can't see because it's just a different type of physics. It's still a physics of sorts, but
you can't see outside space-time because your visual, all your sensory data comes from the space-time universe. So
right.
You can infer things because what's going on outside space-time has an effect on what's going on in the universe you can see, and so you can still experiment it and so on.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, so they're basically causing things that are outside, in this supernatural realm, to emerge to inside space-time with these 2-dimensional pentaquantum projections, which it sounds kind of...
It sounds kind of freaky, right?
It sounds freaky.
Anytime you mention the word pentagram, major red flags go up, like, oh my goodness, this is really spooky,
scary.
Dangerous,
and they said
demonic stuff.
They said in the book, don't play with this, but they brought the connection up, the parallel up, and you're like, well, what is that thing?
Well, because it sounds like this is what they're talking about, maybe opening portals and stuff. I mean, this makes me think of, I forget the guy from D-Wave Systems that talks about, the quantum computer, and it's like it's like you're listening to a beast. I'm forgetting his name, but he's talking about opening portals, using quantum computers to open portals and to go in and to reach in and grab their resources, whatever they may be. It
probably has a bit of a misunderstanding of how a quantum computer works, but I mean, I think I kind of understand what he's getting at. It's they like to think of the things in the states in the superposition as being in parallel universes, and so you're using simultaneously all the resources across the multiverse, supposedly, right? Who knows? Which it may be the case. I mean, it doesn't mean it's mutually exclusive, but
sure.
I don't think there's anything intrinsically occult going on with the D-Wave or anything.
I agree with you. I'm not suggesting that quantum computers are occultish or anything like that. However,
same underlying physics being.
Well, yeah, and I happen to wonder if maybe using those, we will be able to open up portals that, I mean, I don't know. It's only just speculation.
Yeah. Well, and that was their suggestion with the pentagram, that it was essentially opening a kind of portal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting, you brought up quantum computation. That was another interesting thing. Okay, so maybe what I should do is first look at the issue of vibration, and then we're going to go back to there's an issue that's really, because when you're talking about these vibrations, they're talking about it's a reference to probability waves, and when you talk about probability waves, you can then start to talk about quantum information and quantum computation, right? So let me I keep getting lost in this thing. It's not that big of a book. It's actually pretty short. I would really recommend it because it's a fascinating little book. If anyone wants to buy it, I think it's like $15 on Amazon. But
wow! And say the name of it again.
The Quantum Hermetica.
Oh, okay, Quantum Hermetica. Okay. Wow.
I can send you a link afterward, Doug, if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. This is interesting stuff.
Yeah,
Again, just for my audience out there, this is pretty weird stuff, right? There's no question about it. But um, quantum physics is pretty weird too. Okay, Niels Bohr said that if you don't feel dizzy after thinking about quantum physics, you haven't really understood it. So, uh, this is weird stuff. The question is, how did the ancients get this knowledge, right? And that is where there could be some um, some delivery by malevolent beings that maybe weren't supposed to reveal this
they
stuff.
actually talk
I don't
about
know.
that in the last chapter, and they go through a number of hypotheses, and they start with the mystical hypothesis, which is just that this was kind of acquired by sort of mystical insights, and that could make sense with mentalism or vibration, or mentalism or correspondence, because I mean, after all, you could have say some Hindu person is thinking of the world is like this big illusion in Brahma or whatever, Brahman or whatnot, right? And so, okay, well, that's just, they might have just happened upon that because of sort of mystical thing. But then they can point out that doesn't explain the direct physics connections, right? Like, why would you be connecting vibrations with that kind of thing, right? It's kind of set up, and then these vibrations have to correlate to physics exactly. And then they suggest, well, ancient Egypt. I mean, that's where the Masonic text says it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, then the problem is, well, the Egyptians had a lot of, advanced knowledge, right? Definitely, like, say building the pyramids, there was a lot of mathematics and engineering that went into that. But the issue with that is that even then you would still have other pieces of knowledge that you would expect to come along with that kind of like quantum mechanics, right? I mean, how do you get to quantum mechanics if you're not able to do the experiments that generate quantum mechanics, that you need electricity? And if you have electricity, you're probably going to be researching other things as well, such as chemistry or genetics and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, well, this really doesn't seem to fit ancient Egypt. It's like a relic from somewhere,
Right.
And then they get into the issue of, well, if it's a relic, it doesn't fit into our world any more than it fits into the ancient Egyptian world. Even though the ancient Egyptians were advanced, it does not fit into their world. It's this sort of out of place artifact. It's just like, well, where did this come from? It speaks to something coming from somewhere else. And then they actually get into some very interesting stuff about what historians have to say about this. And there was the Egyptian historian Manetho at the time, okay? And this is probably the equivalent of Herodotus, the Egyptian Herodotus. Insofar as you can have a reliable historian of antiquity, someone like Manetho would be as close as you could get to that. I mean, he's not just making stuff up. It's not mythology. This is he's not up to modern standards of historians, but he is, for his time, an accredited historian. And so he's as reliable a source as you can get when it comes to, the ancient world, of taking them at their own word. Yeah. So in his writings, the Egyptian historian Manetho indicates that their origins were in the antediluvian world, which is before the flood. And then he said, in quotes, he said, after the Great Flood, the hieroglyphic text written by Thoth is, of course, the ancient Egyptian god of magic, identical to Hermes of the Greeks and Mercury of the Romans, were translated from the sacred language into Greek and deposited in books in the sanctuaries of Egyptian temples. It is interesting to note that he dates their origins as being 9,000 years old. Given that Manetho lived in the 3rd century BC, this would place the date of the Great Flood at around 9300 BC if we were to stick to Manetho's chronology. This interestingly also corresponds to the date Plato gives for a cataclysmic flood. Given the global distribution of myths of a great deluge of an antediluvian world, it is unlikely that these stories are not based on actual events. And then, of course, it goes on to point out that at that same point in time, you have places like Göbekli Tepe coming across, which that was like 9,500 BC, which it come right after the end of the last ice age at the end of the Pleistocene. And there was this event, called, this isn't in the book, but I do recall this elsewhere, Meltwater Pulse 1b, which happened in 9,500 BC. And it was basically the event that it was the end of the last ice age. It was this big cataclysm where basically the ice caps melted down all of a sudden, and there was this they call it the Younger Dryas catastrophe, basically, and it raised sea levels like 200 feet around the world or something like that, like all at once.
Wow. So,
Yeah,
okay, let's stop right there for a second, because if this information came from the antediluvian world, that's huge. That would suggest that the antediluvians had knowledge of quantum physics, right? I
yes,
mean, that's pretty
that's crazy.
incredible stuff,
That's
right?
that I
And
don't want to draw that conclusion, but like that's what the book is saying, and
I mean, and let's
it's
just
one of
put
those
this
things where you don't want to say it's the
right,
case because it's seen as crazy, and yet
right,
these people are presenting evidence that says, well,
yeah.
uh, what is this? It's really weird.
Yeah, and just to put it in perspective for people, quantum physics is what gave us the microchip, which of course gave us cell phones and computers and all the electronics that we use today
Lasers,
are
use those
lasers.
in
Exactly. When you go to
checkouts at the grocery store.
that's exactly, I was just going to say that, right? So all of that stuff is based on quantum physics. So if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have any of this stuff. But if the antediluvians had knowledge of that, well, I don't know if they would have had checkout scanners in Walmart, but uh, but the world may have been quite a bit different than what we have been told it was all about.
Yeah, and when you
And they
think
might have
about
had
it,
very different technology than we could even imagine. You know,
most cities do not exist in like today. They exist very close to. If you look at the layout of them, I live in Milwaukee. Where do you live, Doug?
I'm in Denver.
Okay, that's in Colorado. It's pretty low, but okay. But okay, Milwaukee is right on the shore of Lake Michigan, right? And a lot of
Mhm.
cities are built on the coast front. Well, what happens when the sea level rises 200 feet all of a sudden?
Yeah. Well, the goodbye
All the
city.
cities get, and
Yeah.
now of course all that gets underwater.
Right.
That could decay really fast. You'd see
Right.
little artifacts every once in a while that were, like what is that? Like that one
Hmm.
fossilized spark plug or something they found
Right.
somewhere. But like it's most of the stuff is, well, where did this come from? This is, where did it go? Well, it's underwater, and they occasionally find ruins underwater, which is like off the coast of play. They found one off the coast of India some years back, and another one off the coast of Japan,
Right.
one off the coast of Cuba actually. Um, and so it's plausible that something like that could be. And National Geographic had this special some years back where they pointed out, well, what happened if all the humans tomorrow were just to disappear for whatever reason?
Hmm.
And they didn't even bring in a notion of a flood, but they just said, let's just say all the humans disappeared. What would happen with them?
Save eight
No,
people. Right.
what?
Save eight people. Right.
Yeah, okay, or save no one, but they suggested,
Yeah.
well, and they said after 2 days, 3 days, the plumbing system would, basically everything would start flooding, and then the power would go out, and then they cycled through, and then after, several thousand years, most of the skyscrapers would be decayed, and then, very short time later, there'd be nothing left at all.
Wow.
I mean, not very short time, but in geologic terms, like they were suggesting, a couple million years,
Hmm.
you'd hardly even notice that there was anything left.
Right.
And we'd just be like erased from history, basically. And 11,000 years ago is not that far back in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time, if it's underwater,
If it's underwater. And
it
I
erodes
once
much
listened to
faster.
John Baumgartner, who developed a computer model of the flood. And according to his model, there were these huge whirlpools that were going around, like probably six of them, gigantic whirlpools going around, kind of like gigantic vacuum cleaners that were going around, or well, he actually described them as blenders. They were going around the Earth, the surface of the watery surface of the Earth at that point, kind of blending up everything at the bottom. So, if his model is correct, then whatever was in that that pre-flood human technology could have been pulverized. Essentially, is what he was
There
saying.
was a guy named Bright Insight on YouTube, or is a guy on Bright Insight, and he had this video a while back about. He was suggesting that there are ruins, like pre-flood, Pleistocene era ruins in the Sahara,
Mm,
especially like around Morocco and so on. And he then pointed out, like, if you look at Western Sahara from a satellite, you see that there are very clearly. It looks like there was, because a floodplain. It looks like there was water had washed across it from east to west at one point, and in a very rapid fashion. And if you do that, if something's sitting on there, and he was suggesting that there were ruins on that, and there may still be some ruins. And I've actually heard stories that there are sometimes ruins that are discovered. Like there was some pyramids that were found. They're actually fairly comparable, fairly large in size, and they were either
mm,
in southern Egypt or maybe Libya or whatnot.
okay.
And no one knew they were there because they were covered in sand dunes. And you have this large vast desert. You think there's nothing there. Well, no, 11,500 years ago, that was actually there was no Sahara. 11,500 years ago, it was a big vast plain, probably with some forests and so on. It was grassy and green and maybe wet. And now it's all dry, and you have sand dunes covering everything.
Wow!
And so some of that could be hidden, which would be kind of an interesting thing if some adventuresome archaeologist.
Exactly. We
would
need
be
Indiana
Jones
or
or Tomb
somebody to
Raider
go.
goes around and finds evidence of something like that in the.
That'd be amazing.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, there's probably all kinds of treasures that are buried, and they're just right under our feet.
Perfect Hollywood movie, but
exactly. Yeah. Well, so back to this whole thing of this Hermetica. Basically, they're suggesting that there was ancient knowledge of quantum physics that probably got lost in the flood. We have some trace evidence of it. This book is presenting it and making the case that the ancients, not necessarily the Egyptians, but people before them, actually had this ancient knowledge.
Yes, and and Manetho actually says that it was passed on to the Egyptians before it was deposited in.
And they didn't know what to do with it, right? I mean, it's like if you dropped a whole quantum physics manual in my lap, I probably wouldn't know what to do with it. I'd be like, it's interesting, but I don't know how to employ this technology.
Yeah, I said, okay, according to the legend, the Emerald Tablet was said to, which is another Hermetic text, was said to be contained in the Pillars of Hermes, along with more than 300 scrolls. They were said to have been moved from there to Heliopolis by Alexander the Great, which is a very interesting question. Makes you wonder what was in the Library of Alexandria exactly.
Oh, I know. I wish we'd not lost that, but oh well.
That sucks.
It does. Wow. Okay. Wow. This is it's pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, and then they mentioned at the end of farther in, you would still have. I mean, look at how much technology it took for us to develop our current state of physics, like technology and infrastructure. Like when you think about a civilization, you have to have a certain amount of. I mean, just a smart person alone is not going to figure this out by themselves if they're living in a cave and needing to hunt, saber-toothed tigers every day to stay alive, right? Or hunt mammoths and stave off saber-toothed tigers every day to stay alive.
Sure.
You'd have to have an infrastructure to do this. You need to have, well, think about what it took to get electricity. You had to have experimenters playing with this stuff in laboratories, and then eventually people would, they had to be supported by a large agricultural system with a road network and so on, and then further
an industrial revolution. Really, you needed the whole system.
You think about some of this stuff required superstring theory, like some of the insights they had that were coming from vibration with tying matter into it. And they had this one where they're talking about a spin net fluid, space-time being constructed from a spin net fluid of like entanglement, a spin net liquid rather. And they had different vibrations in this would produce W and Z particles, as well as various classes of subatomic particles, other subatomic particles. And they were basically able to unify space-time with matter doing this by saying you have this matter is this construction of this entanglement field. And then different vibrations in this, different excitations, I should say, in this field produce or result in the properties of these specific particles. And so, then they start hinting at this I mean, I don't mention the specific particle classes or anything, but they very directly reach the same conclusions that space-time is, or that matter is basically. I mean, they call it the ether because this is 1908 and space-time was really just known, so they're, using 19th century language to kind of describe this at the time. But, when you think about what an ether is in modern 21st century parlance, you think, well, we replace that concept. Now we call it space-time instead, right? And so when you translate the concept, you see, whoa, that's talking about, the discovery of matter being excitations in this, of space-time essentially, or excitations in the same field that gives rise to space-time, I should say.
How does this tie into the Higgs boson field? Like the boson
field? The Higgs boson field will be another particle in there. That's the particle that gives all the other particles mass.
Okay.
So that would be another. Yeah, it doesn't tie in directly in a very explicit way. Only in that it is another particle that is, derived from this field. So.
Okay. The way I understood the field is that it's analogous to water, and then any object within that is sort of displacing the water, and then it's moving within that field, but. Maybe I'm not water, but it's analogous to it. Okay. Well, anyway.
Yeah. So this this thing was okay. So the point they're making is, say you even discover there is such a thing as a W or Z particle, you need to have, or matter in general, such that you could find a way, these particles in general, that you could find a way to unify them with, space time, like this 2004 and 2015 discovery of space time, a matter being unified with these spin net liquid that undergirds space time, right? They call it spin net liquid. It's a physics term. I'm not certain why it's called a liquid, but it basically is a large scale entanglement field, where everything is entangled to everything else. They call it topological entanglement or topological ordering. So you think about the technology that was needed to do that. You had to have particle accelerators. Well, a particle accelerator, if you've ever been, Fermilab, I've been to Fermilab once. It was, it's down in Chicago. It's not too far away from me, a couple hours away from me, maybe an hour and a half or something like that. But if you go there and you see this big particle accelerator, well, that's a lot of the amount of manpower and years of research and manufacturing ability to put into that would have been tremendous. You have to have parts coming from who knows where to put into that thing, and those parts need factories with workers behind them, with a large agricultural and industrial and road system, right?
Right.
Electric power. You need to have a pretty large scale infrastructure to be able to develop this kind of knowledge. You can't just get this knowledge out of nowhere. You have to have infrastructure, and then you can use that infrastructure to do the kind of high level experiments you need to do to actually get at this knowledge, right?
So let's stop right there for a second, because what we have today is based on, as you've been describing, years and years and years of manufacturing, industrial revolution, the right agricultural conditions, so that we can have knowledge increase incrementally. But according to the book of Enoch, they said that these angels came down and they gave the knowledge to humanity, right?
Well,
so
okay, so
maybe could we have a shortcut, kind of jumpstart this whole thing?
Thing. So what they say is, what they point out here is that even still, you'd have to have this associated infrastructure to explain the development of this knowledge, right? And then there's one piece that comes from the Kabbalah that comes directly. You combine it with Hermeticism, and they point to this I'll get into this later. This is really fascinating. They compare it to an MIT document of a description of a Bloch sphere. A Bloch sphere is a particular Hilbert space representation of a qubit, for a bit in quantum computing. And there's a number of properties that are very explicitly referring to the Bloch sphere representation of a qubit, okay? And it turns out that this exact representation, they go through parallel by parallel on this, it shows up in an exact description of this in ancient Kabbalist text called the Sefer Yetzirah. It's describing a Bloch sphere complete with permutations and commutations, like superpositions of bits.
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible.
That is mind-blowing.
Yeah, and the way when then you put it into the bigger context of Hermeticism, which we'll get into as well, when you combine them, you see that not only are they describing a Bloch sphere, they're describing it in the right context. They're describing it as being in this underneath space-time Hilbert space that wave functions exist in. Which, where's the qubit? The qubit is inside of a wave function. Like, whoa, they even know where. They're describing it, but they're describing it. If it's just like one little detail over here, you could say, well, this is pareidolia. You're finding details in this that are. Maybe the whole thing is very elaborate pareidolia, but it's interesting because at a certain point, the number of parallels start to add up to the point where it becomes statistically significant. It's not just seeing patterns; it's saying, well, if this is just seeing patterns, then the next detail we come along shouldn't fit the pattern. Well, it does fit the pattern, and it fits it precisely in the right kind of context you'd expect to see if what's being described is a Bloch sphere. There's a description of quantum computation, or a qubit, in this other ancient text, which also fits into this system. Yeah. So what they're saying is that you would still see evidence of such an infrastructure. They could be pretty advanced to have if they had this knowledge back then. Once they have it, they could still, you'd have, like, say, kind of a weird combination of old tech and high tech.
Right.
But if they were to develop this, you would still see the evidence of it. You might expect to see ancient satellites floating in orbit, and we just don't see that. Who knows what the Black Knight satellite is, but you would see evidence. You'd see someone have a fossilized cell phone somewhere,
Uh-huh.
And you don't
Well,
see that. You do
yeah.
see some strange
Yeah.
artifacts, but not at that caliber. And so what they're saying is that the infrastructure needed to develop this knowledge is not found anywhere on Earth like it should be.
So
Which
let's back up for a second, because, according to Genesis 6, you had the sons of God coming down before the flood, right? And that
Mhm.
seemed to be some kind of a regular occurrence, right? They were coming here, hanging out for a very significant amount of time, right? So if you have these incredibly advanced beings, we'll call them fallen angels, that are coming and they're sharing information, but they're also living here, however that looked, then I would imagine that you could probably go very quickly with a lot of this technology. And there may be different means of, acquiring this knowledge, of even implementing this knowledge. If they have advanced understanding of the universe, and if they
You
were
don't need
able
to
somehow
develop
to
it. All you can
unlock
just get it
portals.
from their knowledge set.
Say that again.
You don't need to develop it yourself. You can just get it from
Right.
their knowledge set.
Right. And then they could actually help implement it in a way that might be far superior to our, slow growth
Yeah, and so you have this
evolution.
really weird situation of low tech
Yeah.
and high tech all combined into one.
Yeah.
Well, where is the evidence of this? Well, it didn't have to be that developed infrastructure wise, because it's coming in prefab.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's already given to us. It's already, yeah, it's coming from this other realm. Call them ancient aliens, fallen angels, whatever people want to call them. I think they're fallen angels, but
They actually, the book
yeah,
actually has a description of this that we'll get into later, which is kind of interesting. It asks the question of exactly what a fallen angel is, and it reaches a
okay,
conclusion that is a little bit uncomfortable to both a materialist academic as
okay,
well as a normal religious person.
okay,
They talk about this actually. It's not exactly. Let's just put it this way: a lot of people like to have an either or when they talk about it. They say, "Well,
Hmm.
you know, no, there are no angels. It's just aliens that ancient people misidentified as such." Well, no, there are no aliens. It's demons that are tricking us, right? Well, they're saying they have this third idea that, well, no, that you add all the properties that you would call a fallen angel on one side, and a fallen angel, by the way, if you read Mike Heiser's stuff, is not the same thing as a demon. There's a distinction between them that we've kind of lost, in our modern context.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, but that's
Yeah,
beside the
he
point.
has some pretty good. He has some. I've actually looked at his
Yeah.
research. He has some pretty good case for this,
Okay.
based on the
Yeah.
beliefs of the Hebrews at the time and what they were
Okay.
recording. Um, so if you have on the one side this description of all the things you would call a fallen angel on the one side, and all the things you would call an alien on the other side, like just list them up as properties, what they're saying is that they would fit both categories at once, essentially. And so in a way, it's everyone loses, but everyone wins, right? So it's
Right. Well, it's interesting. A
both.
lot of the modern ufologists talk about this semi-materialized race of beings. David Jacobs talked about that. John Mack from Harvard, when they were talking to people that claim to have been abducted by aliens or whatever. The aliens told them that they were a semi-materialized race, and they were trying to create some kind of a hybridized race so that they could fully integrate with us, right? So that's according to
Ooh,
these abductees.
that is interesting because there was something in this book. I'm trying to find it. I recall reading it somewhere.
Hmm.
And it's a short enough book. It's less than 100. I mean, it's a little bit more when you add the credit, the references and the table of contents, but it's
Right.
basically less than 100 pages, just under 100 pages, a little under rather, like 90-ish or something like that.
Hmm.
And they describe. I remember the physics actually because I remember reading it elsewhere. But firstly, you've heard of dark matter, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you have this situation where you see stars that are being pulled along by a gravitational force, but it seems to have no center. There's no mass that's actually like it's being pulled along by empty space. There's a mass that should be there that's pulling it, but you look there and there's no mass. And you see this effect all around. It's mapped across galaxies and actually maps very nicely in general to the overall structure of a galaxy. So you have, the mass concentration in the center of a galaxy is higher, and towards the edges, it's a spiral galaxy, and then towards the edges, it's thinner. Well, the dark matter is distributed in the same fashion. It's denser towards the middle, so you could say like you even have like a dark matter galaxy in a sense. It's almost like a a shadow of our own galaxy of dark matter, right? And yeah, so what's the suggestion was by a guy named Verlind, he was suggesting that what was going on was he was saying that there are these other degrees of freedom beneath in Hilbert space that are vibrational degrees of freedom, basically. And maybe I can find I know how to find this. Maybe.
This is amazing stuff. Yeah.
Hold on. My lamp is... Something's wrong with my lamp. Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Yeah.
All right. I kind of look ghosty now, don't I?
Spooky, a little spookier.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Described also in the third chapter. Okay. Oh wait, no. Okay, let's go up. Okay, there are two of them. Okay, here we go. So the suggestion was that you have these. Okay, these degrees of freedom are how. Okay, no, hold on here. Oh yes. According to Mond, the gravitational influence associated with dark matter actually derives from the vibrations of underlying degrees of freedom coming from beneath the emergent spacetime. These degrees of freedom are now how entropy is defined in physics, and modern theories of quantum gravity describe gravity as a result of quantum entropy.
Wow.
So basically what happens is you adding the, it's not in our space-time, but it's adding this extra information there, entropy. And so it's like a shadow gravity effect. You're having this influence into our space-time, even though it's not in our space. I mean, it's in this other universe.
Wow. We're just about out of time, but kind of just summarize some of your main points, because this has really been just mind-blowing.
Well, basically you have very advanced physics discovered in a context. They did enough research to recover the entire system, actually, the skeleton of the entire system in this book. And it describes ancient Egyptian occult science, but what's being described in detail, when you know what you're looking at, it's basically it's modern quantum gravity, emergent space-time physics combined with idealism. It's like quantum idealism framework, and they get into the details of the physics, and they describe things like quantum entanglement here, emergent space-time from quantum entanglement. They have the bloch sphere represent. Let me get to the bloch sphere. I want to look at the bloch sphere because that was an absolutely. Oh, basically, so what they were saying was that these other universes that are vibrational planes, and it actually shows up in various other, like, Hindu texts actually describe these things as like lokas and such, right? They call them vibrational, planes. Well, the thing with it is they would have the same basic physics as our universe, which includes such things as central force laws. And when you have a central force law, you automatically get back, things like gravity and, central force laws will produce. When you have enough mass, what happens? You put the mass together with gravity. It's enough mass, a very large amount of it. It's going to gravitate into a sphere, right?
Okay.
And you say that sphere, the mass is made of hydrogen gas or something. I mean, because it's quantum physics, it's going to produce the same particles. Well, eventually, it's dense enough to produce a fusion reaction. What happens with a self-contained a fusion reaction that is self-contained in its own gravity? What do you call that? Like a hydrogen bomb, but the hydrogen bomb is so heavy that its self-gravitation holds it together in a sphere.
Okay. Yeah.
That's a star, right?
Okay. Sure.
So what they're saying is wherever this other plane has such things as, stars and planets on it, and that's where these so-called, these fallen angels are coming from. They're just in a different frequency domain.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's, like I said, it blurs the line.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of what I was getting at. The whole, electromagnetic spectrum. It's just a different frequency, right? They're on a different frequency than we are.
Yeah, it's like the same concept, but it's applied to quantum waves.
Right.
Okay. Sure. Here I found the description of the bloch sphere. This is an absolutely fascinating parallel. Okay. In fact, one Kabbalist text, the Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Creation, appears to provide a very good description of a 22-level bloch sphere. It's not block as in like a cube. It's named a Felix block, BLOCH, who came with the idea.
Okay.
These 22 letters, which is 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, the foundations he arranges on a sphere with 231 modes of entrance. the sphere be rotated forward, good is implied. If in retrograde motion, evil is intended. For indeed showed the mode of combination of letters, each with each, aleph with all, and all with aleph. This is like, superposition, right? Commutations and permutations. Thus, in combining all together in pairs, are produced these 231 gates of knowledge. Describe something else. So the bloch sphere is a mathematical representation of the state of a space of a qubit. Here, states are arranged on the surface of a sphere in pairs with an axis for each pair of states. Pure states, mean single states, are on the surface of the sphere, whereas mixed states or permutated combinations of the pure states are located within the sphere. This is the description of our modern physics now. Okay, each such permutation corresponds to a different superposition of states, which would process a different probable outcome within the quantum state. This again. What is seen in the description in the Sefer Yetzirah. This is again what is seen in the description in the Sefer Yetzirah. The 22 letters are arranged on the sphere, producing 231 permutations corresponding to entrances within the sphere. Remember, so you have the permutated states are within the sphere. They're corresponding to entrances within the sphere.
Yeah.
The mixed states in the interior of the bloch sphere. In turn, the description of each of these 231 different gates of knowledge corresponds nicely to the different outcomes and information one would expect from different superpositions of the qubit. Likewise, operations, this one is very interesting. Likewise, operations are done on the qubit through rotations of the bloch sphere, when different rotations correspond to different outcomes. This appears to correlate with the example given of evil intent and good intent ultimately corresponding to the different rotations of the sphere in the Sefer Yetzirah. Though only one example of these peculiar similarities to quantum computing would seem to describe letters in superposition in Hilbert space. Given that the context of this passage is in describing the creation of the universe with these letters, this would seem to fit firstly with the general science described before behind Hermetic correspondence, as well as the synthesis of Hermeticism and Kabbalah described here.
Wow.
That's
that's incredible. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank you for coming on, and just a really.
By the way, they do mention the fallen angels at the end. They say the Book of Enoch, and this shows up in like multiple mythologies. Like the Irish even called them like the Tuatha De Danann, and the Sumerians called them the Agigi, the Egyptians called them the Urshu.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's fascinating stuff. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in. This has really been kind of wild stuff, but there's some pretty crazy things that happened back then. And Genesis 6 just gives us the basic genetic problem that was that came about and the basic reason for the flood. But there's this whole other story that much of it has been lost, but maybe this book of Quantum Hermetica, maybe that is revealing some of the information from the other side, potentially. It's hard to say, but Johanan, my bad. I'm sorry. But thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. This has been absolutely fascinating, and it's been great. So thank you, everybody. Till next time. Take care.